All right, we are in Titus chapter 1, starting in verse 5. We covered the first 4 verses last week. Before I forget, the next set of notes for next Sunday, Lord willing, verses 9 on through verse 16 are on the back table or on the foyer table already as well. You can pick those up. I'll also email those out this afternoon at some point. All right, so we're not going to go super in-depth into comparing both Titus and 1 Timothy chapter 3 and kind of getting off on a study of elders, mainly because we did that during the spring, really, when we went through 1 Timothy chapter 3. So if anybody wants to kind of watch our study on elders and their qualifications and so forth, certainly that's available to you. But I figure we will talk a little bit about it, especially what Paul tells us here in Titus chapter 1 as he writes to Titus. He says in verse 5, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city as I commanded you." So obviously, as Paul writes to Titus, he specifies the reason why he left him in Crete, although certainly there were secondary reasons. Of course, the teaching of the gospel is never a secondary reason, but notice the primary purpose that Paul describes here. And this goes to question 1 on our notes. Why did Paul leave Titus in Crete? Obviously to set up or to appoint elders in every city. Define what Paul means by lacking. That you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city. What does Paul mean by lacking?
Left undone.
Okay. Left undone or not complete. Okay, not complete. And certainly without elders, the full plan, the full design of God for the local congregation is not complete. But obviously between when Paul's writing this to Titus, I mean, there have been multiple different suggestions as to how long these churches in Crete had gone without elders, whether these churches were first established on Paul and Barnabas' first missionary journey there, or if they were established Barnabas and John Mark when they went back in Acts chapter 15. But obviously at some point those churches were established. But for whatever reason, and there may have been some churches in Crete who may have had elders at this point, but certainly it appears as though there were multiple cities on the island of Crete that did not have elders. So they had to have gone for a period of time without elders. And that's why Paul refers to them as lacking in the full, complete design that God has given the New Testament church. And so obviously when we talk about elders, and of course associated with elders is deacons, mainly because you don't see an example of deacons without elders. Okay, let me emphasize that. You don't see a single example of deacons but no elders. I'm aware of a situation where there is an individual teaching you can have deacons without elders. And I was kind of shocked by it. No, there's no example of that. Certainly deacons don't have authority given to them by God in the design of what he's established. The elders designate roles to those deacons and so forth. So obviously, and of course verse 5, when he describes these appointing elders, do you think that this is some sort of special dispensation of authority to the local evangelist to establish an eldership, and that only a localized evangelist can do this? Because I have heard this argument as well, that this is special authority being given to evangelists here in verse 5, and only evangelists can appoint elders. That's my question. That would be my question as well. What if you have a congregation that doesn't have a localized evangelist Does that mean even though you have men qualified to be elders, you can't establish an eldership because you don't have a preacher? And it would seem to add in an extra component that is not a design of the local church as God has given it, which is ultimately, what component would you have to have first in a local congregation? An evangelist. Okay? And certainly we see examples of evangelists, and certainly times where they stayed for years on end in certain places. Philip ended up settling in Caesarea. At the same time, there were certainly congregations that didn't have evangelists just stay there. Okay, sometimes they would stay for 6 months or a year and then move on to another place. And so to suggest that only evangelists are given this special dispensation or authority is to read into the scriptures something I don't believe that is carried out within the example of the scriptures. Certainly Titus is being told to do this. Why? Why is Titus being told this? If this isn't special authority being given to all evangelists, then why does Paul say this to Titus?
Would this be the first time they had elders there?
I'm thinking that because Paul, when he writes to Titus and he explains, and of course I'm sure Titus had some other information as well about elders and what their qualifications are, but Paul is making it clear what those qualifications are. That means Titus is going to be equipped with the information and the knowledge to be able to help the brethren determine who fits this example, who fits this pattern. But even in the things that Paul says and tells him, there are going to be aspects of these qualities and characteristics that Titus on his own is not going to be aware of. There's going to have to be discussion with the brethren to determine, for instance, verse 8, being hospitable. Okay? That's not something that Titus on his own, just sticking around for a week or two, is going to be able to figure out. All right, this is going to have to be done. Titus is taking the words of God from the Apostle Paul to these brethren in Crete, and he's saying, okay, here's what the Apostle Paul says, inspired by the Holy Spirit, of a man who would be qualified to be an elder. So who among you fits these qualifications and characteristics? Okay, so Titus is taking this information to the brethren. I don't believe what we find here in verse 5 is some sort of special authority being granted to evangelists that only evangelists can perform. Now, that's not to say should a local congregation, and to that extent a local evangelist, desire an eldership? Sure, because without elders, what's wrong? Things are lacking. Okay, so certainly the goal should be to have an eldership. When there's a lack of individuals who are qualified for that role, you can't. Okay.
What you're saying sounds like these churches or these groups in Crete, they still had to be organized. They didn't know the right way around. We do.
Yeah.
We're not a new group started that's never read.
Right.
What needs to happen, so it sounds like they're using very specific.
Yeah. I agree. I think there's a.
Titus's role is very specific to Crete.
I tend to agree. I think that this is a specific example of a moment where these churches in Crete, either they didn't have information on the qualifications of an eldership, or maybe they just hadn't been taught all of them, or hadn't been told routinely. Okay. However, whatever Paul and Barnabas may have taught on the way through, they're on that first missionary journey, and whatever Barnabas and John Mark may have taught going back through there in Acts 15, there may have been other information these brethren needed in order to fully comply with what God's directives were regarding an eldership. And maybe up until now, no one has been able to get back to Crete, or maybe nobody at least with the word of the apostles with them on how to, or who to look for in terms of character for an eldership. Certainly this would be that example. So yeah, I tend to think that this is Titus in a very specific situation where these brethren, they were not capable on their own with what they had to be able to establish elders. And so Titus is bringing this information, whatever information they lacked, to be able to help provide that and help establish elderships. Anything through verse 5? Yes, sir.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute.
Okay.
Do we have an example of any congregation establishing elders without a local evangelist, or the apostles themselves going back through as they did in Acts and ordaining elders in every congregation where they had gone? Do we have an example of that being done?
Well, if you think about the church at Ephesus, there were elders there. Whether or not they were established while Paul was there, we don't know. Now, we know that he knew them, but whether or not they were established as elders while he was there, but certainly I don't know if you would, of course, I guess you mentioned that he, as an apostle. There's several examples of churches with elders that Paul refers to. For instance, the church in Jerusalem, of course, we talk about having apostles, but there was no mention of a localized evangelist in Jerusalem. I don't know. Are you aware of any?
No, that's what I'm asking.
Okay. I think this goes back to the fact that where you have individuals who fulfill those qualifications and characteristics, just like a lot of times people go to the example of Acts chapter 6, where those 7 men that were chosen to take care of the Grecian widows. That's an example where it doesn't appear that the apostles, in fact, it almost sounds like the apostles were somewhat hands-off. They gave direction, here's what needs to be done, and the congregation in Jerusalem took steps to make sure it was taken care of. However, that was organized. That's kind of a congregational, you can almost call it a congregational meeting type of example, where there had to be some organization there in order to come to that conclusion. Whether or not the apostles took active roles, again, the whole concept of a localized evangelist is not exactly, again, there are examples of evangelists who settle in cities, like in Caesarea with Philip. Of course, Paul, at one point, was it Ephesus where he stayed for 3 years? Okay, so there were periods of time where evangelists stayed for a while. But I don't know that there's a single example of an evangelist that didn't have miraculous gifts. Philip had miraculous gifts. Paul had miraculous gifts. Timothy, as far as we know, based on what Paul says in 2 Timothy, had some sort of gift. It is assumed Titus did. So, if you're going to play devil's advocate, you're going to have to say, well, the only example of an evangelist is one who has miraculous gifts. And I'm sorry, y'all, I can't do that. I don't have the stuff to do that. So, I would suggest that ultimately the example we have is elderships, that is the design of the New Testament example for the church. And while certainly having a local evangelist assists in that work, I wouldn't say that the work is without the ability to evangelize if you don't have a local evangelist, at least in the example of the New Testament. Thoughts?
Well, on the flip side, just because a congregation does not have a local evangelist doesn't mean that an evangelist could not come,
Oh, sure.
ordain, appoint those elders.
That's true. Yeah. But how would that individual do that, having the full information about, just like with the example we're talking about with Titus? Some of these qualifications he's not going to know automatically. Granted, assuming no miraculous gift here is enabling him to do so, he's going to rely on the brethren to tell him, okay, who fits the bill here, who fits these qualifications and characteristics. Now, certainly, one could make the argument that if you absolutely had to, could you get someone who's an evangelist? But how do you define an evangelist? We don't ordain individuals. Okay, it's not a legal, or I say legal, it's not a scriptural requirement for an individual to be ordained to be an evangelist. To a certain extent, all Christians are to be evangelists, okay, teachers of the gospel. So then the question becomes, at what point is it just somebody who's committed themselves to teaching the gospel and therefore they don't work any other jobs? That seems to be very arbitrary definition. And so, again, going back to the devil's advocate thing, I would suggest that building up an argument based on the necessity for an evangelist to establish an eldership, you're looking at that from a perspective that there's a lot of situations that I could foresee where a congregation may have elders, may have individual or men who are capable of being elders, and maybe there's no evangelist anywhere close to appoint those elders. Does that mean they have to wait for however long they have to wait to have elders? I don't believe that's the example we're given.
Well, if that's the case, then in Acts, there was no need for the apostles to go back through and do that.
To do what?
To appoint ordained elders in every city. They could have already have done that.
Well, but we're talking about, right. But I would suggest that on that first time through, that might have been something that wasn't, maybe they didn't cover that. Or maybe, in fact, one of the thoughts that I've had about elders in the New Testament church is that those, in the early years, they were all babes in Christ. How can you have someone who is not a novice, 1 Timothy chapter 3, when they've just been baptized the year before? And so, in fact, I'm convinced that many, if not all, of the early elders in the initial goings of the churches had miraculous gifts. These would have been men that would have been laid on hands by the elder or by the apostles to receive some sort of miraculous gift, especially gifts of knowledge. Okay, that may have assisted them in that service. Because we have examples like in the church of Jerusalem who had elders very quickly after the church was established. But these would have been men who wouldn't have, they weren't the apostles. Aside from, we know Peter was an elder at one point. But aside from that, if they didn't have miraculous gifts to assist them, they would have been considered novices. Okay? New, especially at least in terms of the gospel. And so I think that has to be taken into account as well. That maybe, for instance, in Crete and in some of these other places where the apostles went to establish elders, these individuals needed to have time to grow in the Word and to understand what would be required of them. And then, especially as the fullness of the gospel is being taught and is being provided to these brethren, then the brethren can take into account, okay, what men fit these qualifications and characteristics. Titus, written somewhere around 63, 64, in between Paul's two imprisonments.
So we're talking 30 years after probably being started?
Well, of course, you got to figure the events of Acts 15 or thereabouts would have taken place sometime around the 40s-ish. Keep in mind, Paul kind of detailed the 14 years from the time he was baptized to when he went to Jerusalem. So Acts 15 kind of puts that somewhere in the mid-40s to late 40s. So it's been, maybe 15, 20 years or so. Yeah. So, but keep in mind that there may be some places that have elders, some may not. Yeah, that's true. Oh, sure. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And like we said, and like Joe mentioned, there's not, at least we don't have an example of a congregation that either didn't have the assistance of an apostle or someone sent by the apostles to help establish elders. And a part of that reasoning could be for the fact to make sure that the men who are being established as elders do fit those qualifications and characteristics, so that all the brethren are aware of what those qualifications and characteristics are, and the men match those. Especially in the early goings of the church, that would have been vital. It's vital anyway, but it would have been especially vital because they didn't have Timothy and Titus to fall back to and read and say, okay, here are the qualifications. They didn't have that. No one? Did I see your hand? No.
I struggle with the idea that you're going to go in and these guys would have been given miraculous gifts, and that's what qualified them.
Oh, that's not what I'm saying at all. I didn't mean to suggest that.
To say not a novice, well, if I'm going to go in as Timothy and, by whoever,
Yeah.
apostle, they're going to have miraculous gifts. I don't have to worry about to find men or appoint elders in congregations, across the land in different places.
Yeah.
And so to me, it seemed like more would go back and find excuses or reasons why not, instead of they were able to go back to every city, every congregation, as he's telling Titus to do here in Crete, every city, and appoint.
Right.
Do we just get too picky, sticky, whatever the word would be, that we rule out, instead of completing the thing God has said to do?
Right.
So that we're not lacking
Right.
places.
Right. And certainly there are degrees to certain characteristics. I mean, patience. How do you quantify patience? I mean, there's a degree to which everybody's patient. Maybe they have a little bit of patience, and maybe they have a lot of patience. So it's one of those, sometimes those are somewhat relative, whereas other times there are absolutes. Okay, husband of one wife, for instance, would fit that bill. But, and so let me make sure I clarify that the writings of Timothy or 1 Timothy and Titus, these were, like we said, 15, 20 years after the church was established. Okay, at that point, there would have been men capable of having learned the gospel, having been taught what they needed to know, and having the wherewithal to stand for the truth without having miraculous gifts. Okay, I'm not at all saying that in order to be an elder, they had to have miraculous gifts. I'm saying that in early goings, like in Jerusalem, some of these men were established very quickly. And perhaps it was that assisted them in that process before then the natural, what I would call the natural process of growing an elder, I guess you could say, or men who grow into that character would then take effect. There's certainly certainly Peter, he was an elder. Of course, he was an apostle, but he had miraculous gifts and so forth. All right, anything else through verse 5? All right, verse 6. So here in verse 6 and 7 and 8, Paul is going, it's not quite as, what term do I want to, it's not quite as extensive a list of characteristics necessarily as what Paul wrote to Timothy. Certainly, Paul wrote Timothy, by all accounts, 1 Timothy was written before Titus. And so, certainly, whatever Paul had written Timothy, it's possible that Paul has written Titus similar types of things already before. But what he is at least reiterating, and if not, teaching for the first time, he talks primarily about the character of the man, but he also specifies certain aspects of his family. In verse 6, if a man is blameless. Now here's one of those, I guess you could almost call this a relative. I mean, it's an absolute, but it's from the perspective that, I mean, is anybody perfect without sin? No. Okay, even elders make mistakes, and even elders sin from time to time. So in what way is he using the term blameless? If we're not talking about an absolutely perfect individual who is without sin and never sins, ever, then what are we talking about? Nothing can be, and especially from the brethren, and as Paul would write to Timothy, from those on the outside. Okay, that's something that Paul mentioned to Timothy, one who is without reproach, especially from those who are without. Okay, from outside of the church. So nothing can be laid to their charge. There's nothing that the brethren have that or are aware of that would suggest this man is living in sin or he's entrapped in sin or anything like that. And so to that extent, that's what we're talking about, blameless. Then it says the husband of one wife. And I'm not going to go into huge detail about this. If you're interested, I've got notes, and we talked about it on the video study that we had as well. But the husband of one wife here, people have tried to redefine that and tried to specify what this means. In the end, he is currently the husband of one wife, is what this means. It's the same language he uses in 1 Timothy chapter 3. But this gets misconstrued. I'm aware of several situations where it's been redefined to say he was once the husband of one wife, but now his wife has died. But they only make that argument once a man's an elder, then his wife passes away, well, he can still stay an elder. But what Paul tells Timothy and Titus is if, okay, there's the conditionality of these characteristics. If this man is blameless, if he's the husband of one wife. Now, all of these characteristics are continual characteristics. These are not grandfathered in type of things. Well, he was the husband of one wife when he was appointed as an elder, but then after he was an elder for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, his wife passes away. Well, he's grandfathered in. Would you make the same argument about, well, he wasn't a drunkard when he was appointed an elder, but he has become a drunkard? Can he still be an elder? No. That's true. He can. However, the fact that the continual nature of the fact, in fact, that's one of the things that Paul brings out to Timothy. There is a continual nature. A man must be, not must have been, he must be. And this has nothing to do with accusations against an elder. Okay, this has nothing to do with saying that an elder has done anything wrong. It is about, this is the design that God has established. And there are wise considerations behind that as well. How can an elder who currently is not married, maybe he hasn't been married for 20 years, provide marriage counseling to a young couple of the congregation? Okay. First of all, if he's not been married for 20 years, that kind of takes that, he's been out of it for a while. And so there's a little bit, that's just one example. There's wisdom in having, and plus you have the to a certain extent, I mean, certainly that having that female viewpoint on things, being able to kind of bounce things off of your wife and get a thought for, well, what do you think about this? That helps that situation as well. But this is one of the most important things that we have to understand when we look at the qualifications of elders, is that these are continual. All of them are. We cannot pick and choose what is on a continual basis and what is, it only applies when he's in or when he's appointed as an elder. Because Paul doesn't distinguish that to Timothy or to Titus. And he clumps these together. He doesn't start off by saying, okay, well, if a man has been the husband of one wife, and then says, and he must be blameless, and he must be a steward of God and not self-willed, Paul doesn't do that. He lumps it all in together. These are current state qualifications. This is what he must be now, before he's appointed an elder, and what he must continue to be. And again, this has nothing to do with well, it's not fair, or it's, well, it's not his fault. It has nothing to do with it. This is simply what God has said. Yes?
So if he's the husband of one wife and he has faithful children at the time that he's appointed an elder, and then one of his children becomes unfaithful, does that mean he stops being an elder?
Yes.
Even though they're 40 or 50 years old?
Yes. Yes. And we see this because here in the second half of verse 6, having faithful children not accused of dissipation. Somebody tell me what the King James Version says there. Of riot. Okay? This Greek term, asetia. This term, asetia, it means, Strong's defines it literally as unsavedness, or unsaved character or conduct. Debauchery. Yeah, debauchery. Okay, and again, that goes back to unsaved. It would be, even though they may be a Christian, if they are living in such a way that they are unsaved, as if they are unsaved, unsaved character or conduct, then can that man claim that he has faithful children who are not accused? And then that people bring into the equation, well, let's say the man has 6 kids. 3 of them are Christians and 3 of them are not. Or 3 of them are faithful and 3 of them are not. See, it becomes one of those hypotheticals that Paul doesn't talk about hypotheticals. He doesn't bring that into the equation. Not only that, but when Paul describes this, he describes the character of this man's children not in a way that says, well, if he can't be an elder, that means he was a bad father. That's not what Paul says. Not only that, to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 3, he connects this with, if he cannot rule his own house, how can he rule the house of God? Okay. Again, this is not, it's not a condemnation of a man as a father. Sometimes things happen. Okay? Children make their own decisions. Maybe they're 45, 50 years old. They make their own choices. That may not have anything to do with the father's fault. But that isn't part of the equation. This is what Paul says. He says, having faithful children not accused. Well, the question becomes, okay, well, can one child be children? Technically, according to the Greek term, yes. The way this term is used, it can be used as one child. So from a technical perspective, that's true. However, can anybody think of a good reason why you would look at, and again, I wouldn't say that a man who only has one child would be disqualified in any way. I'm not saying that. But is there any reason why having multiple, at least two, is there any wisdom or any thought process as to what that can tell you as a congregation regarding this man?
Better demonstrate his ability to deal with different personalities, different types of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, no. My 4 kids are all completely different. It drives me nuts. Absolutely nuts. Even if I'd had just the 3 girls, if they could have all been exactly the same, that would have been all right. But no, they're not. Okay? Dealing with those personalities, just, you know. But this is the type of challenge. And especially when we have taken into consideration that these two things together. And what's interesting about this is to Timothy, Paul focuses on the character of the man as he leaves that household. Here, he focuses on the spiritual state of the household itself, primarily the children here. That being the case, when he says not accused of dissipation or insubordination, a lot of times the argument is made, well, that's only while they're in the home. Because they would only be, quote, in submission or subject to the father while he's in the home, or while they're in the home. But here's the problem. The moment they leave the home, if they no longer count against him, how can you also count them as children? Because it says having faithful children. What we're saying is, if you make that argument, is that a man cannot be an elder if all his children have left the house. Because he does not have faithful children in the home. You can't have it both ways. Either they are children regardless of how old they get, and the qualification applies, or as soon as they leave the house, they are no longer children, at which case, as soon as my last child leaves the home, I can't be an elder anymore.
They are still children, but when they get to the point to leave and cleave, as the Bible says, that doesn't mean they're not children anymore.
Sure. Exactly.
They are out of their own household, living their own lives.
Right. Right.
And in that, what he wrote to Timothy, the explanation why you want to know how he dealt with them, can he deal with the household of God, the family of God, a congregation. So that was seen in how he and his wife, dealt with, took care of their children.
Mm-hmm.
But then they reach a point, they're making their own decision, doing their own thing. They're still children,
Yeah.
but they're living their own lives.
Sure.
And for the time they were in that household, that man did show his dealing with them, correctly or not,
Okay.
in accordance with the teaching of God.
Okay.
Can we have a spiritual congregation without elders?
Yes, in that the congregations in Crete existed. They had to function. Now, Paul says they were lacking. He doesn't say they weren't scriptural. And so I would modify that. I would say that a congregation without elders is lacking. Okay? But it is certainly a scriptural congregation in that it exists and it functions the purpose that God has served. It's just, it's lacking that design that God has established. And so for however long these churches in Crete went without elders, which may have been 15, 20 years, okay, they did not have elders. That didn't mean that they were in sin because they didn't have elders or didn't have men who were qualified to be elders. And that's the other thing, is if you don't have men who are qualified, you don't have men who are qualified. There's nothing you can do about that. You know, you could hope that you can get, individuals who will grow into that role, and you can look forward for 5 or 10 years. Maybe you'll have men who will grow into that role. Certainly, I think that one of the reasons why we have a situation in our country right now, and maybe, I don't know what the situation the world over is, but at least in our country, there seems to be a dearth of elders and congregations. And I think part of that reason is maybe that these things are not being emphasized to young men as they're growing up. That one of their goals should be to be an elder one day. Okay? We're losing so many young people to the world a lot of times, not to mention the fact that having young men have their goals of to be a deacon and an elder one day. That needs to be a goal, that they have a long-term goal. And I think that's probably part of the reason that we have a dearth of men who are qualified to be elders. And to Nolan's point, absolutely. These children, they leave the home, they're on their own, they make their own decisions. What Paul says is not indicative of a condemnation against those men. But what he says to Timothy is a bishop must be. Not a bishop must have been a good leader of his home. A bishop must be. There must still be a standard by which they can be compared. There's a standard to which they can be held. It is not a past tense, and it is not a grandfathered in characteristic. These are things that they must be in order to become an elder and must be to maintain their status as an elder. And that is one of the most important things that, especially here in America, I don't know about, again, I can't speak to other places in the world, but this is one area where congregations, I think in an effort to have elders or more elders, they start redefining things, start taking things out of and assuming what Paul means, when Paul says clearly what he means. This is what a man must be. This is what a bishop must be. There's no reason to add anything else to that. Okay, so he says a man must be blameless, verse 6, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. Verse 7, for a bishop must be blameless, a steward of God, not self-willed, not quick-tempered. So the self-willed, quick-tempered, to a certain degree, these are relative in that everybody at some point has a line where their temper starts flaring. Okay, they get frustrated or they get irritated. Everybody has that line. Quick-tempered, well, how do you quantify or qualify quick-tempered? Well, generally, if somebody is quick-tempered, you know it. You know not to push them too hard on something, or they're gonna start getting real upset, okay? Or they're gonna start getting a little hostile, all right? And so it's speaking to that. Now, can you quantify where that line is? No. But it is kind of relative in understanding that you're talking about patience there. The ability to control one's emotions, even when somebody's irritating you, especially given the context later about individuals who are speaking things and saying things that are contrary to the truth. Okay, they might very well try to say things to get under your skin. And elders have to be able to hold fast. Not self-willed, as we talked about. Again, to a certain extent, that's relative in that certainly not being self-willed speaks to what? What's the opposite of not self? What's the opposite of self-willed? Huh? Okay, yeah. Self-willed would be selfish, as opposed to not self-willed, which is selfless. He seeks to be a servant. Okay, he seeks to help others. It's not about him. It's about the brethren. It's about the congregation. It's about the gospel. It's about God. Okay? So that lack of self-will, kind of to a certain extent, it carries with it a sense of ambition as well. Okay? That he's not self-ambitious. He's not self-promoting. Okay? He seeks the good of others. And of course, as a steward of God, is part of how Paul defines this to Titus. As a steward. Okay? Well, this is someone who, generally you talk about stewards, this is someone who's been entrusted with something important or valuable. And certainly being an elder is being entrusted with a congregation of God's people. It says, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money. Not given to wine. Okay? Not given to having any kind of association with things that would lead oneself to their judgment being impaired. All right? Keep in mind, in the New Testament times, what they drank was 3 parts water to 1 part grape juice, which automatically starts fermenting it without refrigeration. But they would drink it as a point of purifying the water. Okay? But if you lingered long at wine, this is part of the reason why Peter brings up in Acts chapter 2, no, we're not drunk, it's only 9 a.m. Okay? Well, if you lingered long, especially if you tried to drink the stronger, not diluted stuff, that led to intoxication. That led to judgment being impaired. And certainly that is what Paul's describing. Not given to wine, not allowing one's judgment to be impaired. Not violent. Okay? And I think certainly physically not violent. But in a lot of ways, this term speaks to even within the character of oneself. Not just that you don't go around punching people every time you get frustrated, but also it's one's character that is doesn't tend towards violence. Doesn't lash out at people, or you have to hold them back because they're wanting to go punch somebody in the nose. Okay, they are restrained. They contain themselves. They control themselves. Then he says, not greedy for money. Now, certainly not greedy for money or filthy lucre, okay, as the King James would say, speaks to the desire for possessions and the desire for money. But in what other way would this be especially applicable to elders? I mean, there's the general way in which, you shouldn't be greedy for money because that then leads to seeking to obtain money, perhaps in unlawful and illegal ways, dishonest ways. But what other situation applies specifically to elders where this may come into play? Yeah, there's that fact. Okay, when you have an eldership, generally at least one of the elders usually, now sometimes, they appoint a deacon to be treasurer, but certainly the elders have control over those funds that are contributed to the congregation. There's that. But also, can elders be supported by the congregation? Can they be paid by the congregation? Paul says, let elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor. And he refers to, do not muzzle the ox that treads out the grain. Okay, so yes, elders can be, I've never known of a situation where that's happened, but they can be supported by the congregation. And so certainly to that extent, you don't want an individual who becomes an elder because they want to get money from the congregation or manipulate people or to be able to that sort of thing. All right, everybody, we'll stop there. We didn't get as far as I wanted, but that's okay because these are things that we probably need to study and talk about. So we'll pick up here verse 7 and 8 next Sunday. Thank you, everybody.